It's the Tayam countdown.
Hello, friendos. This is Chain, welcoming you back to Chain of Commander. The Buffalo Bills are back in the AFC Championship game for the first time in over 25 years, and I'm not going to lie, I'm pretty ecstatic right now. That said, I still owe you folks a Chief Choice Deck Tech for the month, so I figured what better way to celebrate my local team's success than going over what I consider to be my number one new commander to come out of 2020, Tayam Luminous Enigma. This is a budget list, with the whole list coming out to just under $150 on TCG Player, and you might even own a bunch of these cards already. I'll include a deck list in the description below, and even if you don't want to build the whole deck, if there's a card or two that you see that you might want to add to a deck that you're currently working on, definitely consider using our TCG Player affiliate link below as well. Won't cost you a single cent more, but it will help out the channel. That said, let's take a look at our buddy Tayam here. Tayam Luminous Enigma is 1 white, black, green, so 1 in Abzan for a 3/3 legendary Nightmare Beast. Each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional vigilance counter on it, and he has an activated ability of 3, remove 3 counters from among creatures you control, mill the top 3 cards of your library, then return a permanent with CMC 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. That second ability, that is what we're going to be building this deck around. So we are designing this deck in the lens that permanents are what we want with CMC 3 or less. This deck has 88 permanents in it. 84 of those have a CMC 3 or less. So keep that in mind, because if you think of any cool tech that you want to put in a deck like this, definitely add it to the comments below. Let us know. I'd love to hear what spicy tech you folks come up with on your own brews. That said, let's get into this list here, where I start all of my lists at the ramp. Now, when it comes to ramp, as mentioned before, we're going to be favoring effects on permanents over the similar effect on an instant or sorcery. So we're not going to see things like Kodama's Reach or Cultivate in this deck. But in our favor, because of our deck's absurdly low average CMC, we really don't need too much ramp to get the deck's engines going. With all that said, let's go over what we do have in here. We have 3 1-drop dorks that kind of hit all of our colors here. So we have Avacyn's Pilgrim for white, Elves of Deep Shadow for black, and Llanowar Elves for green. Then we have Deathray Shaman, another 1-drop that can produce any color as long as there's a land in the graveyard. And it has some auxiliary benefit, being able to gain us some life or draining our opponents if necessary. We have Llanowar Visionary. This is just a bigger Llanowar Elves, but it also draws us a card when it enters the battlefield. And then we have Rishgar Pima Renegade. This one turns anything we have into, with a counter on it, into a mana dork. And that is any counter, not necessarily +1/+1 counters. So even if it's just Tayam's Vigilance counter on a creature, that creature is now our mana dork. Then we have some land ramp based creatures here in Fertilid, which we can pay to get a land out of our deck. Secure Tri-Builder, which we can sack to get a land out of our deck. And Wood Elves, which gets the forest out of our deck when it enters the battlefield. Then as far as mana rocks are concerned, we have our 3 appropriate signets in Golgari Signet, Orzhov Signet, and Selesnya Signet. Then we have Arcane Signet, just to produce any of our colors. And lastly, we have Soul Ring to be Soul Ring, because it's Soul Ring. Let's be honest here, folks. Soul Ring is going to be everywhere. Then our last bit of ramp that we have in this section is Omen of the Hunt. This is an enchantment from Theros Beyond Death, which can get us a basic out of our deck on the battlefield. But it also has a built-in sacrifice outlet to get into a graveyard that also lets it scry. So kind of neat, and can be recursed later if we really need it to be. So that's how we keep lands available for us to cast things with. How do we make sure we have things to cast with them? Now, Tayam himself is a card advantage engine, but he really has a hard time doing it by his lonesome. So we do have a couple other creatures in this deck to really help make sure that we can maintain cards in hand and cards to play. We have things like Course of Krufix. You see this in a lot of my deck text, this is true, but incidental life gain and the ability to quickly play through a land pocket that's on the top of your deck adds an excellent layer of consistency to any deck that can play it. Elvish Visionary draws a card when it enters the battlefield, kind of like Llanowar Visionary. So it's really just draw a card, and it can be brought back with Tayam if we ever really need to dig deeper. Runic Armasaur. This draws us a card whenever an opponent activates an ability of a creature or a land that isn't a mana ability, and in Commander, that happens a lot, so this guy could be drawing you a bunch of cards. Now, because of Tayam's Mill, there might be cards in our graveyard that we want to get back that we might not have time available to get them back with. So we do have some creatures to help us get things back from our graveyard. Eternal Witness can get back anything to our hand. Renegade Rallier, as long as you have the Revolt trigger, can bring back any permanent with CMC 2 or less from the graveyard to the battlefield. Unearth, similarly, for 1 black mana, can bring back any creature CMC 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Kind of like a mini Tayam there. And then lastly, as far as card advantage goes, while not explicitly card advantage yourself, Viscera Seer is a sack outlet to take advantage of ETBs. If we want to already have a creature on the field, sack it, we can bring it back with Tayam. Or, in response to removal, we can use it to set up our next draws. Speaking of removal, we need to have removal for our opponent's stuff as well. So what do we have for that? Now actually, when it comes to removal in this deck, we have a lot of it. For problematic artifacts and enchantments, we have a full suite for those. We have Caustic Caterpillar, which you can sack to destroy one. Seal of Primordium, which can also be sacked to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Reclamation Sage, this destroys an artifact or enchantment when it enters the battlefield. Night of Autumn can do the same thing as Reclamation Sage, but if there's ever a situation we do not have a artifact or enchantment that we want to destroy, we can choose to either gain some life or put some 1/1 counters on it instead. As far as creatures are concerned, we have things like Playcrafter, which when it enters the battlefield, everybody needs to sack a creature or a planeswalker lest they discard a card from their hand. We'll end up probably sacrificing Playcrafter himself so that we can bring him back with Tayam. Repeatable removal. Feed the Swarm. This can remove a creature or an enchantment. Murderous Cut. This has Delve on it. Because our graveyard is frequently quite full, we will possibly be paying 1 black mana quite often with this particular card. And then we have the 2 best friends, Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares, frequently popping up in white access lists because they're just excellent mana efficient exile removal. Seal of Doom. This is an enchantment that can be sacked to destroy a target non-black creature and can be brought back with Tayam. Retribution of the Ancients. This is a spicy card you don't see frequently at all. However, in Tayam it's excellent because you can exchange counters for mana efficient removal. Oblivion Ring. This just exiles any non-land permanent for as long as Oblivion Ring remains on the field. Collective Effort. This can destroy a creature power 4 or greater. This can destroy an enchantment, or it can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. And for each mode beyond the first we choose, we can do it just by tapping an untapped creature we control. And then we have a couple just board clears and Day of Judgment and Cleansing Nova. Cleansing Nova also gives us the option to destroy all artifacts or enchantments instead. And then Graveyard Hate. You know me, I love Graveyard Hate, and decks like Tayam are the reason why Graveyard Hate should be played. So we have things like Scavenging Ooze, which can eat creatures out of people's graveyards and also get bigger and get some counters on them. And then Soul Guide Lantern. This can exile everybody's graveyard except our own, keeping our own game plan in check. So, we are interacting with our opponents, but they are likely also going to be trying to interact with us. So, what do we have in this deck to help protect our game plan while we're playing? As far as our protection is concerned, we're very, very keen to avoid board clears. So we have things like Selfless Spirit, which can be sacrificed to give all of our creatures indestructible, and can be brought back with Tayam. Inspiring Call. This gives all of our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them indestructible, and then also draws us a card for each one of those creatures. Sometimes we might just cast this to do the card draw side of things, but coming in clutch by giving our stuff indestructible is nothing to scoff at. Then we have Golgari Charm. Golgari Charm has 3 modes on it. It can give all creatures -1/-1. It can destroy an enchantment, but most of the time we're using it for its 3rd ability, regenerating each creature we control. Flicker Wisp. This can blink something. However, it doesn't have flash. It only happens at sorcery speed. So normally you might be using it to take advantage of an ETB and under the battlefield trigger of a creature you might have, but if it's near your graveyard, it can be brought back at instant speed with Tayam to protect something that might be a target of targeted removal. Shalai, Voice of Plenty. This is an excellent card for the deck because A, gives all of our creatures and ourselves hexproof, and B, it has a built-in ability to put a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures. This is one of the more expensive cards in the deck, coming in at a whopping 4 CMC, but she is totally worth it. And then lastly, as far as protection is concerned, we have Spore Frog, the Fog Frog himself, a recursive way to stop combat damage if anybody tries to get silly and attack us with more than we would like. So, you liking this list so far? Then definitely consider hitting that like button because it's only going to get better from here, because we're about to get into the best part of the deck, the counters themselves. I mentioned earlier that Tayam is a card advantage engine, and counters are his fuel. We have several creatures in here dedicated for just putting a whole bunch of 1/1 counters on our creatures. We have things like Pollen Bright Druid. When it NTBs, it can either put a 1/1 counter on a creature, or it can proliferate and put more counters on creatures that already have counters on them. Evolution Sage. This has landfall proliferate, so whenever land enters the battlefield under control, we can proliferate and put more counters on anything with counters on them. We have Conclave Mentor. Whenever a 1/1 counter is put on a creature we control, Conclave Mentor puts an extra one on there for us. Winding Constrictor does something similar, but it doesn't just apply to 1/1 counters, it applies to all counters, including Tayam's Vigilance counters. Then, to make sure all of our creatures get in with a good 1/1 counter start, we have cards like Good Fortune Unicorn, that whenever another creature enters the battlefield under our control, gets a 1/1 counter put on it. Then Renata, Call to the Hunt. While Good Fortune Unicorn uses a triggered ability, Renata, Call to the Hunt uses a replacement effect that just allows every creature to come into the field for us with an additional 1/1 counter on it. Then we have Mana Gorger Hydra. This thing is like the refinery of counters, getting so big, filled with counters so quickly in a multiplayer game. And it has Trample, so it can get in there for that big tramply beats early in the game, and then we can use his counters for Tayam whenever we need to. Abzan Ascendancy and Oath of Ajani. These are both enchantments that put 1/1 counters on each of our creatures when they enter the battlefield, and they can both be targeted by Tayam from our graveyard. Cathar's Crusade. This is one of the more expensive cards in the deck CMC-wise, and is not 3 or less, but it does so much work. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and that can get out of hand very, very quickly. But we also have some planeswalkers in this deck to help us with our counter plan, so let's take a look at those next. We have 4 planeswalkers in this deck, which is actually kind of crazy if you think about it for the budget level where we're at, but hey, we made them fit. So, we have Zhang Yengu, Wildcrafter. This would turn all of our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them into Mana Dork, similar to Rishgar, and he has a minus ability to put 1/1 counters on creatures we control. Then we have Ajani the Greathearted and Nissa, Voice of Zendikar. Both of these have minus abilities to put 1/1 counters on each creature we control. However, being a minus ability, we sometimes need to use their up abilities to be able to use them multiple times. In that case, Ajani can gain us some life, and Nissa can make us some plants. And then lastly, we have Vivian, Champion of the Wilds. This one isn't necessarily a counters-centric planeswalker, but she does help us dig through our deck for creatures, especially creatures to fill the board in the early game, and a couple specific creatures to help close out the game for us. So which creatures would those be? So when it comes to our finishers, they're actually pretty unassuming creatures in a vacuum. We have Gnarlid Colony, which gives any creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it Trample, and Abzan Falconer, which gives any creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on them Flying. Both great modes of evasion to take our creatures, which by the late game should be nice and big and beefy from all the counters on them, and finally being able to get through to hit other players for damage. In a similar vein, we have Regna's Sanction, which you can choose friend or foe. And all your friends, which in this case will likely just be yourself, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature they control, and then all your foes tap down all of the creatures sans 1, giving you an opportunity to swing in and do some damage to your opponents. So, how are you folks enjoying this list so far? We got one last bit to go, obviously. We got to cover the mana base here, but at this point, you've made it this far. Why don't you consider subscribing? We do several deck techs a month, and I'd love to have you folks join us going forward. That said, let's get to the mana base here and see if we can wrap this list up. As far as our mana base goes, we have nothing super crazy here, so no fetches, no shocks, nothing like that. As far as our green-white lands go, we have Branch Loft Pathway, Canopy Vista, Fortified Village, Scattered Groves, Selesnya Sanctuary, Sun Petal Grove, and Temple of Plenty. For our green-black lands, we have Nurturing Peatland, Temple of Malady, and Woodland Cemetery. We have a single black-white land in Isolated Chapel. Then we have 3 lands that tap for all of our colors: Command Tower, Indent the Triome, and Sandstep Citadel. We have Evolving Wilds, which can just fetch us any of our basics that we might need. And then we have 2 utility lands. We have Gavany Township, which can put 1/1 counters on all the creatures we control, and Karn's Bastion, which can proliferate. Then we have 5 plains, 4 swamps, 10 forests, and that wraps up a super fun, super budget friendly, and just an excellent, enjoyable Tayam Luminous Enigma deck. So when it comes to playing this deck, it's actually got a lot of different decision choices to make, but the overall game plan is pretty simple. Your goal is to make your creatures big, get into incremental damage throughout the game, before finally hitting one big damage strike through using something like Gnarled Colony or Absent Falconer to get that damage forced on through. This deck is loaded with removal to ensure that your opponents don't have too many blockers to work with at any given time, so just get out there, make your things big, and swing. Beyond that, if you want to see this deck in action, I've actually played this exact list on a couple other channels here on YouTube. I'll link down to those videos down below. Figured you folks could swing by, say hi, see how the deck does, give them a sub, and just tell them Chain says hi. Beyond that, thank you very much for joining me today. I will see you folks later this week, and you know what? Go Bills!